Everyone who participated in the recording of this track was wondering what the heck we were doing the entire time.
It's a really good way to put it.
We tried a lot of new things on the second album, and I think few tracks encompass that more than Daydreams Looming, which is a kind of the oddball interlude of the album.
I wish you'd hang up the receiver. I'm still waiting on the other line.
Again, this is one of those ideas that started as a joke and then was very much not a joke anymore.
Yeah.
A lot of firsts in this one. The first time I ever played a baritone guitar, and maybe one of the only dueling guitar and saxophone solos ever.
There can't be that many.
This was a very fun one to record because it was so out there. Everyone who participated in the recording of this track was wondering what the heck we were doing the entire time.
It's a really good way to put it, especially given the fact that we recorded these solos kind of separate, but also within the idea of each other. Like, we had tasked Florian with having to record his parts of the solo first without actually having to respond to Ali, which was really funny because that was a big task for him. It was a big task.
Yeah, well, it's tricky when you don't know how much to amp up. When you call it a duel, but you don't really get to hear what happens on the other side of it until after. It's an interesting challenge for a musician, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. And just the fact that you just have to have this kind of weird moment where you just like pull out some kind of lick or riff or melody or something, and then just bite size it and get ready to get attacked on the other end.
I think that's it's hard to say because I was not the musician who had to rise to the challenge. I was the one issuing the challenge, so easy for me to sit back and say, this was so fun. I hope everyone had fun, but it was very fun to observe when you give people that sort of freedom, say like, okay, this is what's going on. We had recorded, Jay and I had laid down the beds for that. We said, okay, it's a duel, guitar and saxophone. Here you go. Here's the space. And we tried a few things, and this is what we ended up with. And I think it's a really fascinating part of the record. I think it breaks up the two sides of the album really well. And it's one of my favorite things we've ever recorded. I think it's so silly and so cool.
It is definitely over the top. And I also like how essentially the song starts as kind of straightforward rock and roll song, distorted guitar, drums, and building up towards what you would think would be either a chorus or a solo or something, and then it breaks into this breaks the monotony of this build towards this crazy like battle of the titans, trading solos back and forth, that then gives away to like this stripped down version of like this kind of weird growth. It's like a weird build and contour, like it's not exactly what you'd expect, but it ends up with this kind of ride that you have to take.
It's one of two tracks on this album where I had two very distinct sort of songs that I fused together.
Yeah.
Which truly came from having fragments of songs written and not necessarily wanting to change them too much to piece them together, and deciding, okay, we're going to have these two moments on the album, the beginning and the middle, where there's a song and then there's something that happens that breaks the song completely.
Yeah.
And then another song that, there are common threads, as with the whole album, but it was a creative challenge of doing something a little bit different that defies expectations in a way, and that also opens us up to new ideas, new things to try. And I think this was a special moment in the album where we really did try a bunch of things that maybe we shouldn't have, but we did, and I'm glad that we did.
It was insane, but it turned out very good. It was one of those trust the process, follow the journey, and see where you end up moments.
Exactly. Safer in Danger.
When it dangs, it hangs.
No, we can't say that. Then we have to explain the joke.
No, that could just be a one-off. That's fine.
We just never explain it.
What's between us?
Okay. We spent a lot of time on this one, and I think it shows. There's a lot of layers in there. We had a bunch of things that we added in overdubs, but I think even the beds, when we were recording them, we really wanted to capture that energy of the quiet loud and make sure that we had that as a solid foundation before adding on to it.
It's even the evolution of the quiet loud, because it's kind of the groove and then loud, you know? Like
It is.
the quiet part, quote unquote, isn't actually that quiet. It's played quite ferociously with this this big groove from Jay and Marika just kind of holding it down. That's in itself.
Well, the quiet is that like the finger picked, like that first section there.
But even that choice in itself is like quite abrasive, you know, like it's quite.
This is actually the last song that I finished before coming into the studio.
Yeah.
And I think it was almost too honest and I was afraid of it. I had a sort of aversion to finishing this song because I was worried that I was giving away a little bit too much of myself in this one. And it's interesting because this was one of those things where it felt so personal that I actually did a placeholder section. The Do Somethings was a placeholder. I like to put these placeholders and be like, haha, this is what's there for now. And then it ends up being part of the song. It happened with Triangle Choke. That chorus lyrically was a placeholder. And then we said, well, I guess that's the chorus now.
In my best revenge fantasy, my hips shut down your carotid artery.
And a similar thing happened with the Do Something section of Safer in Danger. Is it was about not overthinking it. It was about, okay, this is actually what I want to say. This is capturing the exact feeling and we should just roll with it. There were a lot of decisions on the fly for this one. The decision to have a bass solo at the end of the song was on the fly as we were making the beds.
Yep.
I just said, bass solo, and everyone was like, haha, and I said, no, I'm serious. And Marika really rose to that challenge, and
yeah, absolutely.
I mean, I think it's one of my favorite sections on the whole album. I think it hits really hard. I think it's also very cool to be able to spotlight her in that way because she contributed so much to these two albums. It feels really special to have that moment with her near the end of the second album.
An amazing, interesting part with like the world and the song kind of falling apart around her as she is just kind of showing us what she has, essentially.
Absolutely.
Laying it all out on the table, which I think is a great choice in terms of production and something that we haven't fully explored typically. And usually the whole band falls apart or the song rises to a pinnacle and then when it comes back down. And this is this kind of disintegration, which ultimately ends up in the truest of all our disintegrations.
Yeah.
A giant delay feedback swell, but it's this really cool ending that I think is probably one of my favorite endings on any of the albums.
I'm with you, and it does feel, this particular song feels like a culmination of all these things these techniques and ideas we've picked up along the way. I think we sort of integrated them into this one track. We were sort of throwing everything in there, but then in the editing and in the choices, being quite meticulous in, okay, we want this here, how is this going to transition into this? And then, you know, I even went in and added some details with home recordings and vocal stuff. And then when I had recorded those parts, we then got Ali and Eve to emulate sort of what I had done with the vocal on the second half of the song. It's a lot of calling back. And I think it's so interesting, all these sort of motifs and tropes that we were building up through the two albums all kind of come together and explode at the end of this one. And that's really exciting to be able to tell that story. Again, it's like two threads that we're pulling at the same time. Is the story of the album, but also the story of working together, our collaboration with the other musicians. Making the thing is part of the story of the album.
Yeah, and also just the idea of like using some technological textures on this, and like actually really playing with how we can shape it in a maybe non-conventional manner. Like we had a lot of Eve used a lot of feedback, delay, string motif things throughout the piece, which was all improvised. It was all about coming in and seeing what you can throw, which is a little more first album mentality, but it turned out great. And on top of that, we had Jay with his microcosm doing a ton of weird pedal manipulation in time with things that were happening in the drums, as well as the voice and a few other elements that we fed him, and that turned out great. And then I was using this the Moog delay and attempting to get another weird textures where we hear this kind of slow robotic quality to the voice that comes out in certain points that are like very unnatural, but like works so well and complements what is otherwise a relatively traditional arrangement.
Yeah.
Which is something like I think a pushing forward of our textural and production kind of ethos.
Absolutely. Even in the process of recording the vocals is what stood out to me the most with this one, where it's like it started off our kind of standard fare, like, okay, let's get this vocal down. And then it turned into how do we completely break the song with the vocal at the end? And that end section was really a big question mark until we got into the studio. And again, it was about that newer approach of leaving more space to discover what could be there, you know, when you're in a room with more than one person.
Yeah. And I think this is the one where we had you on the handheld mic distorting into the delay. And we were doing that all live.
Yeah.
So that's as tracked as what's heard. That wasn't done in post or anything like that. So that was complete inspiration from the tools and the sounds at hand, with me playing with the delay and then you performing into the delay. And it was this symbiotic kind of relationship of everything else breaking around it at the same time too, which is really cool. And that was a fun kind of process that kind of really tied the song like a bow on the song, because before it was more of a question. And I think we just had regular vocals kind of in, and then it didn't feel quite right, and we needed to try something new and see like what could inspire us to like search for I guess a resolution, but it's the dissolution of the song.
Yeah, it was to take it that level further, and really the idea was always to have the end of Safer in Danger transition into the beginning of No Ambition, but the question was how we were going to achieve that. And the decision in the end to utilize our classic, our go-to feedback, but to play with it in a different way than we ever had, I think was...
And for
it was really fun to do.
As long as
we really drew it out. Some may suggest too long, but I think it encompasses a lot of different things, sort of landing in one zone of our progression as collaborators and my own process as a musician, as a producer.
Yeah.
I think all of these things converging onto the track make it a special one for me.
Yeah, this is definitely like the meeting of a lot of the worlds and different ethos that we've had throughout time, as well as pushing boundaries and exploring new things. And even like the breakdown in the middle that kind of falls out from underneath itself. That was a new interesting choice as well. And with also lots of live manipulation on this throughout this entire song, which really comes through and gave it kind of its own identity, I guess you would say.
It's a vulnerable tune, and I think we really, in opening ourselves up to trying something new and also leaning on, you know, things that were familiar and seeing how those two things could either repel each other or get along super well sonically, that in and of itself is a vulnerable process. So I think it complements each other well to be able to actually achieve that feeling of, you know, the world kind of coming apart in that way, the world of the song, but also on that personal level. How do we capture that feeling of opening yourself up to the unknown, to uncertainty?
Let's jump into Oblivion.
Oblivion. Where to begin? I brought you a 6-minute long demo, and you said, "Can we make this shorter, please?" And I said no.
That is exactly what happened, and it was more of a wondering if it should be shorter, and the instant reception was no, which usually means we shouldn't shorten it.
Yeah, I was very committed to... I mean, this is a song that is a full story. I think that there wasn't really any part that I felt comfortable taking away, especially since it was a song that I had written many years ago, at this point 7 years ago, I was trying to look at these two albums as sort of a time capsule of my 20s, and I think Oblivion, more than any other song, was capturing that, because it was one of those songs that I spent a lot of time, sitting by myself writing, trying to put genuinely just what I was thinking about at the time, which unfortunately is more relevant now than ever. Being able to capture that in this way was very important to me.
Yeah, and absolutely. And like the challenge that kind of arose was, how are we going to create interest and develop a song that's so long, and the changes are quite it's more continuous than it is anything of like very specific sections calling for very different treatments. And then one of the ways that we kind of decided to do that was to allow everybody to kind of have a pass to just see what they do, which is a great creative tool, but as an arranging tool, it can cause a lot of trouble, because you have to sift through everything and make a lot of decisions. And frankly, we had a lot more good than we had bad, so that becomes the issue. And then how do we build this up? Which was an interesting process that just kind of kept getting kicked down the line as we focused on some of the more put together parts. And then by the end of it, it was kind of like, okay, now what do we do about Oblivion?
Yeah.
And then, I had to take some time in the process and sit down, and there's a lot of interesting drum machine ideas. Like Jay just did a pass and put down maybe 10 patterns, and I did a pass of a pattern. And then we had to kind of sift through it and figure out what is the rhythmic structure of the song, which was in its own whole can of worms. And then once that was done, then you can kind of figure out, well, who played with what, how can we add this kind of this cool texture in here and there. There was a lot of like searching, and then at the end of it, we kind of created a skeleton of the song to the original demo organ, and then through that decided to kind of figure out our own identity and path through the use of, we recorded some Juno and some Moog bass and some various synths, and you added some vocal layers, and all of these kind of textural elements came together to really tie it into a larger piece and give it a little through line, as opposed to originally it was just chords, organ chords, and voice, and that was the entire song.
For me, it was important to have the simplest demo possible, because it was such a long song, to not put too much into it before we had really decided the identity of the song. Through that process, I think once we'd gotten into the studio and started talking about it, and we had, a little bit of a feel of what the rest of the album was going to sound like, I had made that decision of, I really think this is an opportunity to have an interplay between acoustic instruments, electric instruments, some more synthetic sounds, some more organic sounds, and be able to play with these two worlds. I even played with that a little bit in the vocal delivery too. We have some vocoder on there, and then we have some of the vocal comps are like these really kind of scratchy, this was the last vocal that we recorded, so at the end of our vocal sessions, definitely, if you've listened to the rest of the album, you know that I was wearing my voice out. I was really pushing the limits of what I was capable of. And so it's a bit more of a tired vocal blended with the sort of like pitch perfect vocoder, I think is a really interesting element to that too. But that was the sort of theme going throughout. How can we have organ and also have drum machine and have real drums and have software organ and real organ and all these different textures, and how do we make that a cohesive song? How do we make that something that's listenable through 6 minutes? Our whole process for this was completely backwards from how we usually work, which I think is so funny, because it being one of the last things that we worked on for this album, we had become so almost comfortable in our process, and we finally kind of landed on like, what is it that we're doing here?
Yeah.
And we had become much more efficient in the studio and really getting things done. And then at that precise moment when we've landed on that comfortable, safe position of like, we really know what we're doing, we decide to completely go against that process and do something completely different. And I think it's exciting that we ended the process of making the album that way, because it opened the door for us to go anywhere else next and not be necessarily pigeonholed into this very specific style of production.
Yeah.
It was there were moments when it was frustrating with this one, where I think it was a big question as to whether we would ever end up in a place that, one, we agreed sounded and made sense, but also there was just so much to work through that it felt like this huge task compared to the rest of the album.
So many different layers and textures.
Yeah.
And strange little things that were lying in the ether that kind of came out, and like even listening back, I'm like, wow, that's cool. What is that?
What is that?
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I mean,
Who made
that's,
that? You know.
but that's the most exciting thing that I can think of is to make something that has that kind of effect where even when we listen back, we're surprised by it or we hear something different in it than upon first listen. That to me is the most I could ever hope for from, something that we've made.
That's very true.
Why won't you fight for it? Discard the excuses that I can't trust. Why won't you say anything other than suburban
Well, Shae, this has been a pleasure. Thank you for sitting down with me, taking the time to talk through these 2 albums that we made together. Hopefully, we will do many, many more projects ahead. I've learned so much from you, and I'm so appreciative of all the knowledge you were willing to share with me and just the time and energy that you've put into making my little songs into something a little bit more substantial. I'll say maybe a lot more substantial, and introducing me to such wonderful people. I really am so grateful for your friendship and for your engineeringship.
Thank you. No, and likewise, thanks for the partnership and the trust and the ability to do these projects together and like go through the rabbit holes we need to go through and to get to the results that we need to, and the process, the destination, and the journey itself is all always worthwhile and always nothing but fun. And I can't wait to do it again and again and again as long as we can.
I think so much of what I was trying to communicate in these 2 albums was putting aside that fear of being known by other people, being understood, just being able to move forward in life with an openness as opposed to a protectiveness of myself, so much so that it was isolating me and keeping me away and keeping me from really experiencing love and joy and all these things that are really essential to our survival. So much of what I've learned just in the process of making this music has informed how I move through my life in general and has changed so much of that for me. And you were a huge part of that. So thank you for that.
Pleasure's all mine. It's been very fun revisiting these albums and kind of looking back at what we did and trying to reverse engineer and remap them all. It's a fun revisiting, It
can be easy to lose sight of everything that went into it, but it's been really special to be reminded of that.
Absolutely.
Well, I think I sort of tricked you into having a heartfelt moment.
Yeah.
So I appreciate you tolerating that to the best of your ability. Let's do this again sometime.
Absolutely. And this concludes wrapping up Shelby's albums.
Goodbye.